The view of the UBS CIO is that companies that are better at recruiting, hiring, and retaining talent from diverse backgrounds are more likely to be innovative and profitable over time. This includes LGBTQ individuals. So, as we celebrate Pride Month, we dig deeper into the whys and the hows on this topic. Let's find out right here on UBS Trending. Hi everyone, and welcome to UBS Trending. I'm your host, Ainsley Carbone. Amantia is back to discuss another topic from the latest SI Perspectives publication. Amantia, what I find fascinating about sustainable investing is that it truly is a way to think about finding investment opportunities in the context of change. So that's change in investment environment, change in societal perceptions, and also in the change of what's most important to investors. So speaking about societal change, we get into the profitability part of the story. Let's talk about the demographics of the LGBTQ community in the US and globally. So what is the size of the population and why does it matter?
Yeah, of course. Happy to join you on this conversation, Ainsley. And you're so right. Sustainable investing is about change. And this is because this is something that investors really care about, right? We just spent weeks thinking about the debt ceiling, and that's change that perhaps people did not want. And now that that's settled, let's think about these longer term discussions. When it comes to the LGBTQ plus population, we're thinking about it in two ways. One is, what is data telling us about the individuals and families that identify as part of this community? And then two, what's the broader society, those that don't identify as part of the community? What are their perceptions? And this is important because it does indicate how companies have to adjust to changing and shifting winds and what will matter to them. So thinking about the data, US provider Gallup, a survey provider, noted that in 2023, 7.3% of all American adults identified as LGBTQ+. Of this population, if we look at it broken down by generations, for the youngest generation, those born after 1996 or Gen Z, the number is much higher. Is 1 in 5 Gen Z identify as being members of this community. Now, not only we're seeing this difference sort of intergenerationally, but also over time. When we look at the all American adult population in 2012, so just a decade earlier, the number was much lower. It was at around 3.4%. And what this shows us is not that something is changing meaningfully or kind of inherently with the population, but more likely a higher degree of willingness to self-disclose and maybe becoming more salient, more important to how people self-perceive, which is then important for us as investors, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now, what about those other people who the other 93% that don't identify as members of the community? Well, if we look at just one proxy, which is acceptance of same-sex marriage here in the US, 71% of Americans now are fully accepting of same-sex marriage as a right for this community. And that number also has been steadily going up over the last couple of decades. So really just kind of we're seeing this shifting winds, as I mentioned earlier, which makes it increasingly salient and material for us.
Thank you, Amantia. It's certainly interesting to think about the shifting demographic trends on this topic, and it's particularly exciting to hear that there's certainly an increase in societal acceptance. So let's get back to your research. Can you tell us why it's so important for companies to embrace diversity specific to the LGBTQ community, and how does it enhance profitability and innovation?
Yeah, of course. I mean, ultimately, we watch these social developments in order to identify how they're important to companies and investment portfolios. So when we think of the LGBTQ plus community, we think of it really in two ways as regards to companies, either as employees or as potential consumers. So according to one research study from one investment manager, the global total household wealth of LGBTQ plus families is estimated at about $23 trillion. Now, I would take that number with a little bit of grain of salt because it is based on estimates that make some assumptions on population trends and so forth. But what's important here to note is that it's a significant potential number, right? If you assume at least 5% to 7% what we're seeing in the US globally. So that's one thing here. Who are these consumers? Are companies positioned positioned to cater to them and their needs, and is that a missed opportunity? Now, even more, I guess, nearly to today, we think of this community as potential employees, and we tie it back to our research on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how companies that can hire and retain people of different talents, regardless of their personal identity, their gender, their sexual orientation, their race, are more likely to be more innovative over time. Now, if we think of LGBTQ plus people, we know, for example, that even in times of not very high social acceptance, there's a cost to prejudice. There's one study that showed how the US military, when it went through a period of firing 14,000 individuals who identified as LGBT in the years between 1994 and 2010, incurred a heavy cost of having to replace these employees. The cost was about $53,000 US per person, that added up to $750 million according to this study over that period of time. So that's the cost of prejudice, right? And that's regardless of what societal levels of understanding and welcoming of the community were. And we as investors understand it. Every time that you cannot retain an employee and you need to replace them, the cost of identifying them again, retraining them, potentially renegotiating with a new person go up. And therefore, as investors, we really care about finding those companies that get this as well, right? They see these trends, they have it built into their policies, and they really care about hiring the talent that they need, regardless of who they are, or maybe because of who they are.
Well, it's certainly interesting. I wasn't aware of how significant that cost of the prejudice can be, so thank you for that. So shifting a little bit, can you tell us a little bit, what does investing in companies that are more inclusive look like? And is there a way that we're able to measure it?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question ultimately, and there's a lot of work that is being done on this and some progress. But I would say, unfortunately, this is one of those challenges that we're facing. There are not a lot of data sources that cover the entire breadth of the market with a high degree of assurance that allows us to kind of pinpoint those companies that focus only on this factor. One of the more robust data sources now is the Corporate Equality Index, that is essentially a rating system, a scoring system provided by the Human Rights Campaign that allows companies to self-disclose their policies on LGBTQ plus inclusion and then gives them a score. So about 1,300 companies globally have submitted something to the report, and on a score of 0 to 100, 1,100 companies, so most of those that submitted something, score at least above an 85. So this is interesting. It tells us that these companies have robust policies in place, and that they think it's important to get a validation, right? Someone saying, yes, you're doing well, or someone giving them a score, someone giving them some feedback. So this is a universe, it's a small universe, but it's a good starting point for us to say, what are these companies that have recognized this thesis, and how are they doing? Now, when we look at this data, one of the interesting things is that companies in the consumer discretionary sector are the ones that are more likely to submit, to respond to the survey, and the ones that are more likely to score better on average for their sector. Which is interesting. It ties back potentially to my other point here earlier about LGBTQ plus people as consumers. So maybe those companies that really are consumer-facing are more likely to understand that they need to be transparent about their internal policies, so that because they're targeting to both of these communities, right, consumers and employees. So that's something that we're paying attention to, and we're looking at how it develops.
So it sounds like there's definitely a way to measure it, although we should certainly be taking it with a grain of salt. So Amantia, what are some of the risks out there that our investors should be aware of?
Yeah, of course. So I'd say the first thing, as with everything in sustainable investing, we're focused on what's most financially relevant to the company. So investors may care about different topics because of their values, one way or another, but they can act on what they think is most important to financial profitability of a company. So that's the lens through which we're thinking about diversity broadly, and selecting companies based on how they're doing on diversity, this topic as well as how they're thinking about or how they're positioned in markets and other financial metrics. So that's one thing I would note. Secondly, even though we started the conversation, we're talking about the positive kind of trend and growing acceptance, we have seen over the last couple of months here in the US at least two high-profile instances of backlash against companies that are very kind of firmly positioning in their product lines kind of in pro-LGBTQ ways. And what that has indicated is really this importance of focusing on materiality. Investors should identify those companies that are really kind of tight on their policy, their practices, are targeting consumers accurately, and we recognize that companies are walking a fine line in kind of complex political discourse. So that's very much also a risk that we're monitoring as we're thinking about the longer term and balancing it with the shorter term.
Wow, that's great. Certainly really helpful. Now, Amantia, we only have a little bit left, maybe 30, 60 seconds. Can you just let us know any final takeaways that you have in mind?
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, just to summarize, diversity, equity, and inclusion is an important and financially relevant topic for investors to consider. This is across the board, and for this LGBTQ population is important as well for them to be kind of put part of this equation. So that's one. I think a second point is that data is improving, but is still kind of patchy on this topic, and so we recommend investors think about it in the context of holistic inclusion. And then third, take a look at our research on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on longer-term themes, or broadly on sustainable investing to find more of these ideas. I think that's a fair takeaway as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Amantia, and thank you for joining us today for the conversation. It was nice to see you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
For more information, visit ubs.com/views. Make sure to follow UBS on social media, particularly our new Instagram channel called UBS Trending. Lots of great information for you there, including never-before-seen footage from our studio. And as always, if you have any questions about your portfolio, please speak with your financial advisor. Until next time, I'm Ainsley Carbone. Have a great rest of the day, and remember to keep your eyes on what's trending.